Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Archon's Adversaries. Today we're jumping into our next Adversaries campaign. As per your lovely votes, we are traveling a little bit further afield, up north into the Calixus sector and the Glorianum subsector. Luggnum at night. So, let us set the scene. It all started on the evening of the day of the Emperor's Ascension. The day of the Emperor's Ascension is an oft-celebrated imperial, essentially celebration or break from work, similar to the oft-quoted Sanguinala. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, or the Day of the Emperor's Ascension, is a day where many Imperials call off of or have off of work. They are given an opportunity to labor in service to the church or to their families in many cases. It is a very important religious holiday because it is, well, representative of many different things, but in its original form it was supposed to represent the date upon which the Emperor of Mankind officially unified all of Terra and ascended to the stars as the leader of the now great Imperium of Mankind. Quite a holy day, and one that a planet like Luggnum, a mining world, takes to heart. It's a time where a lot of people have off work or they have shortened hours at work. And now, Luggnum is a mining world. The labor is relatively hard, so when civilians come home, they have about two things on their mind, especially on a day like the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension when they have time off. The first of those things is their family. And of course, the natural inclination is, well, I've taken some time off work, or I've been given some time off work, I've met with my family, I've gone back home to them, I've hung out with them for a couple of hours, and now evening has come, early afternoon, and I'm going out to procure the evening meal. And we start out on a street just like the one in front of us, in Hive Movis, one of 3 hives on Luggnum. Now, Movis is a relatively normal hive, and like most of the hive workers on the day of the Emperor's Ascension, it is host to a much larger amount of foot traffic, as a lot of workers are off for the evening and are out trying to get their families something to eat. And on a street just like this one, there is a public food dispensary with a long line of partially harassed but mostly sanguine individuals just waiting to get their food and evening meal for themselves and their families. Now, this is a fairly normal encounter where there would never really be much of a problem. Food is generally given out almost for free, and at least as long as you've been working that day, there will be no problem with it. However, on this day, on this particular street, in this level of the Underhive, well, something unfortunate has happened. They're sold out. Due to a bureaucratic oversight or possibly a feast time restriction, this food dispensary is out of food. The servitors that would usually automatically prepare, package, and move the food are no longer allowed to do so. Their programming has been neglected, and they are no longer serving for the evening, with several hundred people still waiting to get fed in a long line outside. And as the regular hemming and hawing, the administratum drones at the front desk, and the locals trying to make do with what they have without the official assistance of the building itself, well, some of those people waiting in line have an idea. It's that little voice in the back of your head that you often have when you're driving home from work. It's, my God, do I really have to suffer this? Is this the best that I get? I'm not supposed to be having a stressful day. I'm supposed to be celebrating the God Emperor. I'm supposed to be able to get what I need from this place the same way that I do every single day. And on this day, I've just gotten the brush off from what is essentially a mindless machine and a bunch of know-nothing drones. Man, that smarts. It stings, and that voice in the back of these civilians' heads comes to a bit of a conclusion, or at least one of them does. One of these gentlemen, an individual who is waiting in the front of the line, makes the first bold step. The grating, or the gate behind which the kitchen of this public food dispensary is located, isn't that strong. He's a well-endowed physical miner, and with one hand he rips the chicken wire fencing clear off between himself and the startled staff. The Administratum drones and about half a dozen servitors are in realistically what you could expect to be surprised public service terror as round about 50 people try and jump the counter to go ransack the food supply. There is an alarm set off as this happens, and as a result of that alarm, local police are called. Now, this is not abnormal in and of itself, but what is abnormal is that little voice, that annoying frustration that tends to build up in these civilian worker drones of the Imperium, it's not just hitting that first guy, it's almost universal, and he's certainly not alone, as he and maybe half of that 100-person group who had been waiting come back out into the street, their arms filled with food and supplies looted from the public dispensary. Now, of course, they are in the wrong, they have committed a crime, but at the same time, they are most definitely feeling a little self-righteous at the moment, and they don't feel any need to turn over their ill-gotten gains, especially because they're all together and they've all acted as one. So when 2 or 3 local policemen show up to respond to the alarm going off, the group scatters, or the few who don't scatter fight the returning officers. And the one man who jumped the counter becomes the 2 who follow him. The 2 who followed him become the 10 who start tearing up supplies. The 10 who started tearing up supplies becomes a full-blown street riot. The entire building ends up being torched at the end of the night, and large groups of hundreds of individuals, all led by that same frustration and self-righteousness combination, end up trolling around the Underhive for a couple of hours after the 7 o'clock at night that this started happening. And so we have an actual riot on our hands, a food riot, which is not abnormal within the Imperium, but here it is getting a little bit out of hand. The local police have already had quite a few of their officers basically beaten to within an inch of their life, and a couple more have even had their service weapons stolen. What is worse, a food riot is particularly dangerous because it impacts everyone. The people who couldn't get food at this dispensary are going to go home to their families, and when they hear about other dispensaries being broken into, ransacked, and emptied, well, they're certainly not going to wait for somebody else to steal their food for the next couple of weeks, so they will go out on the town with their family and attempt to loot whatever they can before the law clamps down upon them. So, just another night in just another Imperial Hive. Movis may be having a bit of a rough evening, especially given it's such a holy day of the God Emperor's ascension, but it's certainly nothing abnormal, just an unfortunate series of circumstances. But what causes a civil uprising like this, and what are the steps of this kind of civil uprising? Well, that's the flashpoint, a food riot. A place runs out of food, or they have some clerical or clinical error that forces a group of people to be deprived of what they consider the bare necessities for their life and comfort. It's particularly strong or poignant on a day that is supposed to be for celebration, like the day of the Emperor's Ascension. But what about Luggnum Hive Movis? Why would a mining hive be withholding food from the miners? Well, there's usually 2 options, and in this case, it's not exactly clear which. It might have even just been a glitch in the Administratum system that had forgotten to account for the day of the Emperor's Ascension. Not an unreasonable thing. There are a lot of different food dispensaries, and they only receive uncommon maintenance, let's say. Poor supply or parsimony. Now, poor supply is one thing. This is a mining world. There's not going to be a lot of food provided by the planet itself. Most of it is rock and dark evening most of the place. It is not really unexposed to light, but a large portion of the hives remain in consistent shadow over time. So on one hand, they could be low on supplies, but the more likely reason is parsimony. Essentially, due to various factors, The planetary government has restricted or set up curfews or limitations on who, when, how, and how much calories can be withdrawn from these public dispensaries, which of course they control. Now, parsimony is usually for a reason. They either are expecting some sort of trouble, or there is some sort of danger that they foresee of starvation or of need for food in the future, which is why they limit what you can eat, beyond anything extra. But whatever reason it is, it doesn't really matter to the people within Movis Hive. They've just been deprived of their evening meal, and they're quite upset about it. So, let's talk about Luggnum as a planet. It has a population of 1 billion total, spread out amongst several smaller hives, and including every single armed defender, it has around 2.6 million armed defenders. That includes its planetary defense force, which is up to the Imperial standard, its local police, and a small group of Arbetes per every hive. Essentially, it's a small precinct house on 2 or 3 levels of the hive. And the Arbetes are there to keep the peace and also to provide what the local police cannot without being a fully armed PDF. There are, as mentioned, 3 major hive cities. That is not to say that they are major as in they are large, more to say that they are major as in they are the only large grouping of human beings on the planet. There is not a lot of external settlement outside of these hives, because most of Luggnum's surface is almost brown-gray moon rock and loamy earth that isn't good at providing much other than oxygen. So, not many people live outside of the hives, and only the 7 mining hubs are usually partially attached to or really local to the major hives. So there's 3 hives: Movis, Dorsch, and Falmouth. Movis and Dorsch are both mushroom hives, those kind of ones that are built a lot wider than they are tall, with multiple spires. They only have 2 or 3 actual levels above the underhive, and they usually have wide, deep underhives, which is the case with Movis, where this food riot starts. The last one is Falmaroth. Falmaroth is the spire hive, and as a result of being a spire hive, it is the capital. Each of these hives, however, does have its full spaceport, its own void shields, and its own orbital weapons that we'll get into in future. Attached to these hive cities are 7 mining hubs. These mining hubs bring up a lot of different stuff. So, what is that stuff? Well, the history of any major mining world is really based on 2 things: provision and neglect, almost always. Provision is essentially, once the planet was originally colonized, it was dictated how much and what type of materials they could produce over what period of time. Then they were given a certain set amount of starter materials and told to make do. It is fairly rare that resupply or complicated tithe negotiations occur around a mining world. And it's really because they don't have much abnormal to produce. You're not going to suddenly find a bunch of unexpected resources on most mining worlds, because most of them mine out exactly what they know is already in the crust of the planet. You wouldn't have a mining world if you weren't already sure you were going to find something there. Now, for Luggnum, the majority of what it produces are high-grade metals and various types of materials like metals. So metals and metalloids produced in large quantities from the planet's core. These mines are not exactly strip mines. They are fairly different. Some of the ones, like in Movis and Dorsch, are very deep underground, and they're almost like lower lithosphere mines. They're designed for really deep penetration into the planet's surface, so that they can dig up long veins of hardened iron and other materials from deep under the ground. Falmaroth, on the other hand, has several strip mines and quarry mines that it uses not only to collect and distribute spoil, but also to remove more complicated and more expensive and complex materials like gold, precious metals, silicate gemstones, and things of that type. Now, why do I say neglect is often a common thing for mining worlds? Well, outside of the fact that they are brutal in their overall labor regime, outside of the fact that they have a very consistent tithe and no real reason to change it, there's also the fact that most mining worlds are not really problematic. They don't usually have labor issues, because Mines can basically employ as many people as you want. The mines are massive, and everything around the mines creates labor and jobs of its own. And since you don't need to create more jobs, and you also do not need to worry about anything else, because most of it is provided by the Imperium, for example, food, water, etc., is going to be provided by the Imperium of Man, in many cases. There is water on Luggnum, it's just underground and usually recycled. It's not great stuff, but it'll keep you alive. But that means that the Imperium doesn't care much about it, and Luggnum, while it is provided for and protected by the tithe, it really isn't a garden spot that nobles visit or that politicians harp on about. It's not a tourist destination. It is a working world. Not in the way that a forge or a war world is a working world, but it is a working world in that it is consistent, reliable, and very, very, entrenched in tradition, so to speak. And this is a great example of that. When something breaks tradition, when there's an abnormality in the day-to-day or year-to-year routine, well, that gets people very, very upset. And that's how civil unrest begins, that neglect. So, the escalation process from our riot. Now again, we went from 1 to 2, 2 to 10, 10 to a full-blown riot of 50 plus people beating the hell out of the local police. Well, what's the escalation for the Hive? Well, the first one is local police. We've talked about this in the PDF video, how local police and Arbetes work together, where the Arbetes have very low numbers but much better equipment, and the local police have higher numbers but considerably worse equipment. Now, on Luggnum, the local police are very close to what we would consider strike breakers in our modern day. So if you could imagine if there were coal riots or mine worker strikes, things of that nature, it would be the job of the local police to break up those riots or demonstrations themselves. For this reason, most of them are not armed with lethal weaponry. The vast majority of them are only equipped with things like billy clubs, nightsticks, and the occasional knife. Some of them do also pack a little bit more heat, especially because there are gang areas in Luggnum, but these are not violent gangs generally. They are just gangs of workers who know each other and who have family and cross ties in their community. You could consider it like community watch organizations, or the kids on the block, so to speak, when we talk about Luggnum's gangs. They are nowhere close to the level of somewhere like Necromunda, where they are an entire industry in and of themselves. No, these are local gangs, usually built off of tribal or living conditions reasons, and a vast majority of them still live and work perfectly well within the average Imperial cycle of work, sleep, eat, repeat. So, what happens for the escalation? Well, if the local police can't deal with it, they're going to back off. The local police are civilians. They will be going back to their homes, clamping down on their protection, and trying to ride out whatever riot or roving bands of violent, angry people are running around in the Hive. It's not their job to break up that level of momentum. No, that job falls to the Arbetes. And the Arbetes, well, it's already 7 p.m., and the Arbetes are very well aware that if they go blazing into the Underhive at 7 p.m. on the day of the Emperor's Ascension, that's going to have massively negative consequences. Not only would their presence there disrupt the daily flow of things and interrupt a lot of people's celebration, possibly causing the riot to get worse, they also know that if they are around at night, they will interfere with Luggnum's curfew. Now, Luggnum's curfew has absolutely very little to do with actual sleep, and it has more to do with its labor population. The labor population of Luggnum includes a relatively small but fairly consistent population of abhumans. These abhumans have the limitation that essentially they're always on night shift. So while the regular people, the regular citizens of the Imperium, work the 8 to 12 hour shift during the daytime, the abhumans come out at night and they work the night shift, and most of them sleep during the day, and essentially they are not entirely proscribed from coming out in the daylight, but they are definitely limited in where they can go. The majority of this abhuman population are nightsiders, spiders, ogrins, and others of their kind. A couple of mutants are there, but most of them are taken care of by the Arbetes a vast majority of the time, as the Arbetes do regular culls to go into areas or precincts where abhumans are present, and essentially to kill anyone who sticks their head out of the doorway. Then again, we eventually come to another problem. If the Arbetes can't go and quell the riot right now, well, something bad might happen and it might expand, and we'll talk about that later, with possibly eventually the PDF getting involved. But first, the Arbetes pick a quote-unquote conservative approach. They stick on the first level of the hive, on Spillway 9. Spillway 9 has the upper level of their Arbetes precinct house, or the lowest level of it, rather. This precinct house is a relatively fortified police station, essentially. It's built on the corner of one of the major roads on the first level of the hive, and it is, like most of these mushroom hive areas, level with the regular ground. However, right in front of it is the lower city stairway, also referred to as Spillway 9, because when the hive was being built, it was used as a spillway for spoil and water pollution, etc. And they are aware that this problem is probably going to spread, so they set themselves up. And remember, this started at 7 p.m., and by the time that they are ready to go on Spillway 9, it is 10 p.m. The evening curfew on the level above the riot begins. So this violent riot occurs, the curfew starts, regular people are told that they should likely go home, abhumans are starting to be brought out to begin their half of the shifts. 70 of the Arbetes, the majority of those who are working in the precinct house, spill out with the goal of ensuring order at the Spillway 9 stairway. Now, there are several things between this entrance to the Underhive and the Precinct House. The first one to the right is a kind of shanty towns built up of a lot of the mid to halfway getting out of the Underhive riffraff, so kind of a disreputable area, while the left side is mostly abhuman housing and industrial plant works, so a little bit of refinery buildings, a little bit of cheap tenement housing, and hab blocks. And closest to the lower city stairway is a set of market stalls. Now, we've talked about the internal industry and the internal ways of getting food, supplies, and equipment within Imperial hives, and these local markets are basically a godsend for the average Imperial worker. They provide you with all different types of things that you're not provided by the government, and in many cases they are relatively cheap, and given the fact that this one is built right next to the Underhive, even though the Underhive is relatively large and quote-unquote well-to-do in Movis Hive, it is still indicative of it being a little bit more seedy and shady. This is kind of like the Dollar Tree, if you know about what that is. So, at 10 p.m., the Arbetes prep their way out. They split into squad groups of 10, and they set up improvised barriers. Usually these are steel brackets that are set into the ground to protect against riots and to keep a distance between their precinct house, where there's weapons, equipment, and essentially just stuff that they don't want the rioters to get their hands on, and the roadway where the rioters are most likely to come from, the lower city stairway. Now, they set themselves up in 4 different positions, and they have a mechanized or a light motorized vehicle sitting at the end of the roadway, essentially waiting to make sure nobody comes out of this alleyway and gets out into the roadway. And they get out just in time. By 10:05, a horde of furious miners, opportunistic gangsters, spill up the lower city stairway in a group of over 1,200. Now, these folks have been rioting and rampaging all evening. What originally began with only 100 angry or angsty individuals has grown dramatically, mostly out of fear, concern, and that kind of knock-on effect. You know, if you get your food from this local location and you know that it's going to be broken into, there's a pretty solid chance that you're going to lose out on food for a couple of days, especially if the Arbetes come down and shut the place down as a punishment for these rioters. So you're going to join the group, and if you haven't gotten your fill of food yet, well, you might just have to keep going with them, and maybe the next place that they break open, you'll get an opportunity to steal there. Now, the gangsters, like I said, are more of a local community group. They're not necessarily the organized, violent gangsters that we would expect, so they are not necessarily here to get food. They're here to try and grab anything of value from these looted stores and locations. They're also goading on the crowd to try and get them more and more invested in this uprising or upswelling of violence and aggression. So the gangers are pushing on this horde, the miners are just frustrated and angry and trying to get what's best for them so that they can survive, and everybody's kind of ticked off that it's 10 o'clock at night on what should be a peaceful, celebratory day, and I'm out here walking through the stews of the Underhive trying to get out. And so, they head up the stairs. And basically, it goes to absolute hell in 5 minutes flat. The horde of rioters trash the market stalls and begin driving people towards the precinct house. Now, because of this changeover where the abhumans and other laborers are coming out for night shift, the market stalls are in a also state of flux. There are individuals who do night shift work who are swapping over to man the stalls, and there's a lot more people in the area than would normally be in this transition time. So, seeing a bunch of angry and partially armed groups of individuals, because some of the gangsters do have knives or firearms or steel pipes, etc., the market stalls quickly empty as a lot of civilians essentially run back to their homes or try to get inside of a hab to take cover from this angry riot that is currently absolutely tossing the place. These groups basically face zero resistance. A couple of shop owners put up a fight, but it doesn't take long before they're either convinced to get out of the way or the gangsters move them out of the way. Now, after that first 5 or 6 minutes of chaos and carnage of ripping up the market stalls, they've got a little bit of ego boost, and I think it's pretty easy to imagine. Nobody's here to stop us, no one has slapped us yet, and every local policeman that we've run into has basically turned tail and hightailed it back to his house. So, what's their next target? The largest and most fancy building on the street, the Arbetes precinct house, which of course bears the imperial eagle, along with various other pieces of adornment. And so, at around 8:10, the horde moves onward, and they split up quite a bit, some of them following and chasing individuals into the shantytown, while others take the long way around this hab block to try and come at the precinct house from down the street. They pretty much all get into position in a couple of minutes. However, at the time when the Arbetes and the rioters are about ready to size each other up, many of them have reached opposite sides of that roadway in some cases, a crew of nocturnal abhuman work levies are released for their night shift and the evening hive maintenance. That's this gray line here. Now, in many cases, these are Nightsiders, a couple of Ogrins, and a few other mutants or abhumans who've been mixed into this levy crew. This is a very common thing with abhuman work gangs. They're not just individuals employed by the government, they're actually just large numbers of abhumans grouped together and told to do a basic menial job, and then they're given provision for doing that job. So they don't really have any options, they're not permitted the best possible working conditions, and realistically a vast majority of them are just doing this because it's the only option they have. And they are going to work. They are heading right down this main roadway when they come across this unfortunate stalemate between an active riot and the Arbetes precinct house most southern line. Now, by 10:26 to 36, the horde of civilians in front of the Arbetes hit the road across from the Arbetes gun line. Basically, in 4 separate locations, 1,200 people start goggling and then start slowly walking towards the Arbetes. Again, egged on by these gangsters. The gangsters are aware that there's an opportunity to loot some stuff from the Arbetes precinct house, and they are still unaware of how violent the Arbetes are going to react. It's not as if they haven't seen Arbetes murder people before, but maybe if there's a bunch of unarmed civilians around, these gangsters will be able to run up and shiv one of them and then steal their shotgun and their armor, which is a massive boon for a lot of gangsters. And again, these are locals. They're young kids and teenagers. They're here causing mischief, not trying to cause an active battle in the Underhive. They just want to go and steal some stuff, maybe chip some gold off of the side of the precinct house. They're definitely willing to get violent, and a few of the older salts are definitely nursing some wounds and frustration, the same way that the miners are, but basically none of them are prepared for what happens next. The Arbetes have a very solid plan. They order them to disperse, they fire a few shots in the air, and then after about 2 minutes of ordering the crowd to disperse and trying to disperse them with weapons fire, the Arbetes level their weapons and they open fire. With these crowds basically pressed against the barriers and gangways that the Arbetes have set up to protect the alleyways into the precinct house, it's a one-sided slaughter. The entire group in the center that is actually an open terrain in the roadway from the lower city stairway is basically gunned down to a man. They are obliterated by a mix of shotgun shells, bolt rounds, and quite a few heavy bolter rounds from a position on the precinct house's roof. It's incredibly violent, and again, most of these are unarmed civilians who are carrying possibly the spoils from their theft, and in more often cases, some improvised torches or perhaps a couple lengths of pipe amongst them. This is hardly an enemy who's willing to stand up to the Arbetes, and the entire front line, quote-unquote, of that 1,200 individual group is half massacred and then half flees back into the Underhive. Now, on the northern side, it's equally brutal, as they get raked by heavy bolter fire that shreds several houses, causing a lot more civilian casualties, as several of the people living inside of the shantytown are also killed by Arbetes' fire. It's a carronade of 70 individuals, essentially letting off with a mix of shotguns and bolt weapons at point-blank range. The entire roadway is awash in bodies and blood, and at 10:30 at night, the city is screaming, and this mix of violence unfortunately catches someone else in the crossfire. Only a few minutes after the middle group and the northern groups are completely shredded, that southern group that came around the Hab block gets impacted by the group of abhuman workers. The gangers push in a lot of their fellow miners and malcontents into that menial worker cadre, using them as cover. Again, these gangsters are here to make some money off of the occasion, and the miners just assume that these abhumans are, like them, in a bad mood and ready to start a fight. They're not. They have absolutely no idea where these humans came from, and they have absolutely no idea why all of a sudden a bunch of fairly regular people are choosing to fall in line with this work crew. However, as they get to within about 15 feet of the Arbetes line, which isn't covering or blocking the street so much as it is off to the side, they realize what is happening, and the movement forward and back trying to escape the riot, or the gangsters trying to push on the miners, well, the Arbetes bring in their support vehicle and massacre the work crew along with the gangsters. So there's this moment of back and forth as the abhumans realize that this is violence and they want nothing to do with it, and they try and back off. The gangsters push a bunch of them forward. The miners try and surge forward, seeing all this violence. They have that moment of moral outrage. They manage to try and charge the barrier for a few seconds, and then a light personnel carrier from the end of the street with an Arbetes shot cannon on the back basically shreds the entire group. And it's a horrible bloodbath. The abhumans flee off into the darkness, all thought of work basically destroyed. The last group of gangsters and miners are routed, many of them too wounded to continue, others arrested, run down with shock batons, or simply too wounded to run away, and it's a bloody scene at the end of the massacre of Spillway 9. Now, out of the original 1,200 rioters, it probably only takes 120 to 150 of them actually dying immediately before they all break and run. It's very, very quick. The expectation of quick, easy victory like they've had over the police is shattered by the very real and visceral memory of, oh my god, the Arbetes do not give a shit and they will 100% kill all of us. So, really, it only takes around 150 to die before they start breaking down, but of course, the Arbetes do not limit their death toll to just rioters. Including civilians who are caught in the crossfire and the abhuman work crew, well over 400 people die in what is a matter of about 24 minutes. So in less than half an hour, several hundred people are slaughtered on Spillway 9. Now, this massacre is going to have some negative effects, or really it's just going to have some effects upon security. Now, this causes pretty predictable outrage amongst Hive Mobus' population, especially its abhuman underclass, the idea that these relatively peaceful people were just trying to get to work one day, and because a bunch of idiots were messing around in the street, they get absolutely slaughtered by the law enforcement. Again, the Arbetes are not local, they're not your friendly neighborhood cop, they're Judge Dredd here to murder anyone who's seen as a bad person. The abhumans don't see themselves as bad people, so of course the question is why? Why did they go ahead and slaughter a bunch of our folks with a bunch of these malcontents? But even amongst the rest of Movus' population, there's a twisting of the story. It's the day of the Emperor's ascension. All of these people are subject to starvation. What had begun as one little food riot has now grown into an actual movement that has become quite aggressive and quite angry at the Spillway Massacre. So, the Arbetes, as a result, are activated in Movus. Each Hive City basically has a couple hundred Arbetes total. Now, that's a fairly heavy Arbetes present, and realistically, it doesn't go anywhere above 200 in most cases, with most of those not being Judge Dredd-style Arbetes, but rather being more regular police officers, with only a couple of squads of those better armored, better armed, heavy Arbetes enforcers who are used for culls and such. But the Arbetes in each hive, Movus, Dorsch, and Falmerath, are all activated, and the local police are sent out into the mineworks the next morning for extra security. Now, the local police are not abnormal to find at the mineworks, but usually it's because there's already been an issue. A mine collapse, some sort of violent encounter, a fight, etc. The local police are called like the local police in our day, but the local police are sent out ahead of time to the mineworks just to make sure that there's going to be no issue with work the next day. And it's also to get a bunch of them out of town in Movus so that they don't have any repercussions from the massacre. Again, if you know that you're probably not going to be able to take out your frustration on the Arbetes, you might seek out your local peace doer and try and put a bullet in the back of their skull. So, they're sent out of the hive. It also makes room for the rest of the Arbetes to actively roll around and patrol the streets, doing riot control and putting out fires in a way that is much more efficient than the relatively weak local police. So, everybody's put on notice, all the civil unrest society quenchers are put out on display, and well, the result is pretty predictable. More riots begin. And within Movus, and after 2 days, the lowest level of the hive are put on forced confinement. Now, forced confinement, if you don't know, within a hive basically means that all of the major access ways, so Spillway 9, all the other spillways, most of the other rail and road and stairway connections between the underhive and the first level of the hive are severed, or at least there is a strict curfew put into place where you're not allowed to travel between levels of the hive past a certain time. Now, this forced confinement isn't anywhere as brutal as turning a hive into a prison, but it does certainly mean that if you need to travel freely within the hive to do your business, it's going to have some negative effects on your livelihood. It also means that the Arbetes can focus upon doing one thing at one time and another thing at another time. So during the day, they go into the underhive, they ensure peace and prosperity, and then at night, they come up to the first level of the hive and make sure that there are no leaks or subsequent sympathetic violence on the first level of the hive, and they don't have to split themselves out. But it does also isolate the underhive and prevent anyone from really getting a good ear to the ground, at least for the time being. All three of Movus' mining structures and entrances continue to work as normal, for the first few days. However, after that point in time, communication is totally cut off, and the local police units stop responding on the third day. Essentially, all of these people on the second day were experiencing communication issues. Some Vox connections weren't working, some of the servitors that are hooked up by a wire stopped functioning, and then on the third day, all of the police went out. They got to their mining positions okay, the communications were still bad, and then none of them came back. Some of the workers came back, none of the police came back. So it's unclear what exactly is happening there, but by day 3, Movis Hive is starting to get a very sinking feeling that something is wrong. And so as a result of that sinking feeling and the disconnection with many of these local police officers, the PDF is mobilized to investigate. Again, the PDF is essentially the standing army of the state in the Imperium, and they have much better weapons and equipment than the local police and far higher numbers than the Arbetes. And they're sent out to investigate on the morning of the 4th day after basically none of the local police force come back, along with the Arbetes planning a massive cull of the lower levels. Essentially, the Hive decides, let's hit this real hard with every force that we have. The PDF is mobilized in some part to go out to the mines and make sure that there's no dangerous fuckery occurring there. And then the Arbetes do what they do best. They plan on going into the unruly Underhive and committing about as much murder as you would expect in order to pacify the population. So, once Movis's confinement is lifted that same evening. So we've got two different spurs going out. We got the PDF going to the mines, and we have the Arbetes going down to do a cull in the lowest levels of the Underhive. And what are we doing next? Where are we checking out first? Where are we going? Who's getting involved? What is the result? All things that you get to vote on, and the new votes that are coming up soon with, again, new series and new content coming out. I hope that you guys like this one. It was a little bit more, I was trying out different narrative styles because I think that you guys gave me some really fun stuff to play with last time's vote, so I'll be working with that. Don't worry. The other thing that's going on, the next Adversaries is coming up soon, probably tomorrow. I just didn't have time for it today. But once that is done, there will be another vote for that. I do have a stream tomorrow at around 7 p.m. EST, so please feel free to join me for that. We'll be talking about Adversaries. We'll be talking about the next one coming up for the Tau. You guys chose to double down and do a full war, so it's taking me a couple extra days to really get that organized for you all. But yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed. I certainly have. This is going to be a really fun campaign. I can already feel it. I can already feel how much fun this is going to be because I love the internal security of hives, and of course, if this goes badly, we have a lot more population to work with. 1 billion people split over 3 relatively small hives is quite the fun campaign if you've ever experienced kind of mass combat in 40k before. Either way, with that said, I wish you all a lovely good night.